Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Akoma Gaither, and I'm a Public Program Associate here at the Minnesota Historical Society. I'd like to welcome you all to our book talk today with author Dr. Chad Montry and special guest Mr. Marvin Anderson. Our mission here at the museum is to serve the people of Minnesota by creating a powerful engagement with history to build a more inclusive and informed society. Our audiences understand the pivotal time that we are living in and value the critical role that history can play as a force for community identity, understanding, and purpose. Whiteness in Plain View provides an earnest look at the subtle, insidious, and sometimes violent ways in which Minnesotans engage in segregationist policies. The geographic scope allows us to better appreciate historical institutional barriers to full citizen rights and economic opportunities afforded to African Americans in the state and throughout the country. For Montry, the current racial order is a consequence of the formative role of Minnesota's effort to exclude and contain Black residents through an evolving set of means, from government aid to extra-legal racial violence, intimidation, and threats to ideological tools, such as discriminatory media and educational practices and policies. We appreciate you taking the time today to join us for this important conversation. Following our presentation today, we'll hold a Q&A, and after we'll be holding a reception with food and drinks, and Mr. Montry will be available to sign books and answer any following questions that you may have. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Chad Montry. Mr. Montry grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and received his BA from the University of Louisville and his MA and PhD at The Ohio State University. He is currently a professor in the history department at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and he is the author of 5 books, including A Bigoted Prejudice, Hateful Little Area, The Making of an All-White Suburb in the Deep North. And he is also the author of a recent article in a 2020 edition of our Minnesota History magazine titled, In That Very Northern City, Recovering the Forgotten Struggle for Racial Integration in Duluth, Minnesota, which looks at the aftermath of the Duluth lynchings and the struggle for racial equity. Lastly, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, Mr. Marvin Anderson. Mr. Anderson is a community activist and has been a key figure in the effort to memorialize the historical Black neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul, which was destroyed in the 1960s during the construction of I-94. He is also the co-founder and first president of the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers and serves as the board chair of Reconnect Rondo, an organization studying the feasibility of developing an African-American cultural and economic area surrounding a land bridge over I-94. Let's give Mr. Anderson a warm welcome.
Well, good morning. You know who I am. Why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell them who you are and get comfortable here right now. Say hello to your neighbor. Oh, hey, good to see you. All right, that's enough. You're taking my time now. That's the way of the African American church. Every church service begins with hello to your neighbor, and we're happy to see you. And where's that money you owe me? Good morning. My thanks to the Minnesota History Center and Akoma Gaither for allowing me to participate in this discussion of a particularly important book, Whiteness in Plain View, by Dr. Chad Montry. It's also a pleasure for me to share this platform with Dr. Moultrie. I'm going to call him Chad, because I have such profound respect for his book. It's scholarship. He's provided a documented analysis of the history of whiteness in Minnesota. And it's a revelation, and I would urge you to read the book if you haven't already done so. It will be a pleasure and will be an eye-opener. Because Whiteness in Plain View offers a harsh but an honest overview, and it demonstrates how, through these methods that Coleman mentioned, including the threats, vandalism, and the violence, restricted housing covenants, realtor deceit, and overt discrimination, Minnesota's overwhelming whiteness is not accidental or incidental. This history of racial exclusion in Minnesota is woven and embedded deep into the fabric of our contemporary policies, economy, and culture. Chad provides a blueprint, how it came to be, and how we might be able to change it. So I'm here to offer some views on Chad's book, but I am also been asked to update chapter 6 of the book, this visual vice, black removal in St. Paul. This chapter is particularly a marvel because he reports on the circumstances, the concerns, and the troubles, and the ills that beset the community of Rondo when they found out they were directly in the pathway of I-94. These were turbulent times for the Rondo community. These were times when the community of Rondo was torn asunder, and it makes for a wonderful, but at the same time bittersweet remembrance of those times as they were articulated in Chad's book. Here's Rondo very quickly. I want to just bring you up to date on Rondo for those of you that may not know. In 1930, you can see that's the Rondo community, those dots. Every dot there represents about 500 people or so. That's the map in 1930 of the Rondo community. This map was done in 1935 by the demographer for the city of St. Paul. In this map, unfortunately you can't read it, you will find that there are pockets. These pockets here, you see that word Negroes, that says St. Paul's largest Negro slum. That's Rondo. Over here, there's a slum of Mexicans and Jews. Over here, there's another slum of Jews, Mexicans. And then here is St. Paul's middle-class neighborhood, and right here is St. Paul's Gold Coast. So the city of St. Paul in 1935 had identified Rondo as a slum, St. Paul's largest slum, and it included Mexicans and Jews and other parts of the city. But at the same time that they were saying that St. Paul was a slum, Rondo, to those of us who lived there, was a thriving, predominantly African-American community where people did the very same things that you did in your community. You celebrated birthday parties for the kids. There were the weddings. There were the engagement parties. There were the festive activities. There were the people who worked and lived there. There were our debutantes in Rondo that came out every year at 18 years old. There were professional people in Rondo. There were the small businesses in Rondo. There was the drum corps, an African-American drum corps. And one year I was in that drum corps, and we marched in 26 different cities around the state of Minnesota. I've been in Corn Days. I've been in 100-year anniversary celebrations. I've been in Cannon Falls, Montevideo. I've been in Blue Earth. I've been in International Falls. I have marched all over the state of Minnesota and always left those small communities saying, boy, that was a great parade. Didn't we have a great time? But guess what? I didn't try to live there. And that would have been a difference in my reception. I understand that now. This is Rondo. Rondo had the education. It was the first place, one of the first places where African American nuns taught at St. Peter Claver in the Rondo community. I stopped there very quickly because that's the 1950 graduating class from St. Paul Marshall High School. And I stopped there because every one of those African Americans who were in that class went on to college, had a career, because that was the thing about Rondo. Your education was most important because you heard it over and over and over again. You're not going to have to do the kind of work that I did when you get old. You're going to go to school. You're going to learn. You're going to make it. Those are one of the jobs, the main jobs in St. Paul was at the Union Depot. There's 36 men in that picture. I've got information on 24 of them. Those 24 men worked a total of 560 years at the St. Paul Depot, back at the time when 220 trains would go through the Union Depot each day. And they, before roller bags, they, before your backpacks, they would grab your luggage for you at the curb. They would take it all the way down to the train. They lift it to the overhead, and they were lucky to get 5 cents, 10 cents a bag. Yet those 36 men, the 24 men that I have, all own their own homes in Rondo. When I looked at their descendants, we're talking about lawyers, doctors, accountants. One of them has a son who has a show on the DYI network. There's two who had been in Hollywood films, small business people. These were the backbone of our community, along with the waiters and the porters that served those 220 trains throughout the St. Paul Depot throughout the summer. The reason that Rondo was important to us is because there was a northern route. That northern route, for those of you who know St. Paul, that's Pierce Butler Road. Back in 1950, Pierce Butler Road was more desolate than it is now. That's the route that Rondo preferred. That's the route that our people who were fighting for us preferred. That's the northern route, but instead of the northern route, it's coming right through Rondo. And I remember this so well at the time that this is a kind of a cartoon, I think, an editorial cartoon, where the mayor of the city of St. Paul was asked, which would you prefer? And this is 1952, but he goes all the way back to 1935, and he picks out the one word that he knew would make people just come to his conclusion. Which would you prefer, development or slums? And the slum clearance, City OK, that was the final blow that started the destruction of Rondo. I think I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, okay. But it wasn't a slum. You can't read that. I wish you could. But here is the things. So the downtown business interests, city council, and the state legislature successfully lobbied for the freeway location as it is now built. The freeway location was a political decision, not an engineering one. It was a political decision to exclude, to greedily go after the money that was made available to communities that could do freeways. But the kicker was, if you could find a slum, you could also qualify for money under the urban renewal program. So you get 90% of your money is returned to you. That's cost-free. If you were able to build your section of the freeway and you saved any money, that money went to the state legislature. That money went to the state legislature with no strings attached. So when you come to buying a home, 700 homes, and you're going out to buy these homes from the people who are in the pathway of the freeway, the way you save money is you lowball the offer that you get them. Because that when you lowball it, it saves money, goes to the state, you come back to the office, you're given so much money each day. You got to go out, give you $25,000, you got to give me 5 homes. If you come back and you got 5 homes and you only use $12,500 or $13,000, and I go out and I come back to you and say I need another $5,000 for my 5 homes, who do you think is going to get the cheer at the end of the road? Who's going to go out for the beer? The guy that wants more money to buy a home, or the person that's coming in with extra money? And that's before you had anything like job security, because somebody could tell you very easily, I got 8 veterans out there that need a job. They're going to get the job done. If you can't get me the houses for the money that I give you, you got to go. There's Rondo as it started being destroyed. And now I'm going to show you a quick video that was done by some young students. Part of the deal that we like to believe in Rondo is that the memories of the elders can be translated to the imaginations of the youth, because they have the skill and they have the talent to take these memories and do things with them that we're incapable of doing. So if you could show that video now.
Since 1956, Rondo has lost more than half of its population. There were once almost 3,000 homeowners in Rondo. Today, only half as many remain. 700 homes were lost to the construction of the I-94 highway. Along with the homes that were taken, the destruction of Rondo, 300 black businesses were also lost. As a result of the destruction of Rondo, the wealth gap between blacks and whites living in Minnesota increased. It is estimated that $157 million in revenue for the black community have been stripped between 1956 and 2018. Today, the average Rondo resident cannot afford to buy a home in the Rondo area. The wealth that has been lost by the African Americans in the Rondo community between businesses and homes was critical to the progression of the black community in Minnesota. This money could have gone to pay for college degrees and starting more black-owned businesses, increasing the overall being in the black community to the present day.
The destruction of Rondo by I-94 resulted in a loss of equity and homes that could have been curated at a total of $157,150,000 in generational wealth for blacks by the year 2020. That means since 1958, these houses generated full equity twice. This inheritance could have paid for 4,800 four-year college degrees. At the time, one house was worth 7 college degrees. According to the 1980 census, the 700 Rondo homes could have provided degrees for more than half of all 18-year-olds in Ramsey County, or for every black child between the age of 10 and 24. Currently, the income opportunity gap in Rondo North compared to the surrounding Twin Cities area is nearly $99 million per year. If Rondo South was included, that gap would reach almost $147 million per year. While this is a great loss for the Rondo area, it is also an opportunity to restore hope in the community and provide equity that was once lost through the building of a land bridge. It also gives way to another opportunity for improved quality of life for the overall black community of Rondo through black business ownership, as well as parks, recreational centers, and cultural events.
Those students have been working with us now, and they have a course, and They do all of the work. They do the filming, they do the editing, they do the writing, and it's a course at the High School for the Recording Arts. You start as a freshman and you can graduate with what they call a degree in Rondo history. So that's Rondo as I remember it. There was some wording there that hopefully I can give a. That's the Rondo Commemorative Plaza that was built in 2015 to commemorate that. Minnesota is the best and worst. Affordability, economy, education, quality of life, and safety. You've probably seen those statistics. But for African Americans, it's ranked the 4th worst state in the nation for African Americans. Home ownership is 25% versus 76%. It's become the epicenter of racial injustice with Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, and then George Floyd. They lost 700 homes, and the equity wealth there, just to give you a little bit, dig down on that, that's a little bit, they took 700 homes, and what we did is didn't take 700 homes, we took one home, and we compared it, and it was comparable to a home at 1248 Minnehaha, let's say. The 1248 Minnehaha home is used as the standard for the appraiser when he comes to Rondo to appraise your home. So if that's a 2-bedroom home with a garage and appliances, that's the standard home, and there's a price on that home. He comes to a Rondo home, and then he marks off, based upon that comparison, the value of your home. They had 2 bedrooms, they were nice, you had one of them. In other words, you keep lowering the price based upon that comparison. So you take that home and you sell it 2 times since 1950, like the home on 1248 Minnehaha is concerned. And each time they sell it, you multiply the price of the home on 1248 Minnehaha by the 700 homes in Rondo, and that's how you get a $35 million equity loss. That's just the equity. If you come forward to 2022 and you take the value of a home in Rondo now, $225,000, and you multiply that by 700 homes, now you're looking at a wealth gap of $157 million. That money could have stayed in Rondo. That money could have funded the small business in Rondo. That money, Rondo people did not put their money in stocks and bonds and in banks, especially coming out of the Depression. Every nickel and dime sou that they could recover was placed in the one thing that they called their home, their castle, their home, the place where they could live and die, pass down to their kids. All of our memories are in the attic. That's why it was always swept, kept clean. It wasn't your first home until we make enough money and we move to another part of town. Moving to another part of town was literally impossible in the 50s and the 60s, as identified in Chad's book, Whiteness in Plain View. You couldn't move. You couldn't just get up and move. That's why you put your footing, you put your heart and your soul into the Rondo community, in that home. That's why it was so depressing when it actually left. That's why we're trying to do this restorative movement to lead the effort to revitalize the Rondo community with a land bridge that connects Rondo and reignites a vibrant African-American cultural enterprise district. Those are pictures of the land bridge, and you saw that picture. So I want to wrap up by saying that the Rondo story that Chad has identified in Chapter 6 is must-reading. That's a little bit of the background, what happened to Rondo. And the aftermath of Rondo now, since that freeway, we have 18 factors upon which you can judge a community. 18 different factors. The store, health, air quality, home value. There are 18 different factors. Rondo ranks negative of all of those 18 factors at the present time. Our land bridge won't cure everything, but it will provide in this land bridge an opportunity to be an African American-led enterprise district, promising jobs, homes, cultural institutions that reincorporate the values of the Rondo community and make them whole. So the discrimination and the intolerance that led to the destruction of Rondo and to the other cities in the book, these things need to be addressed, and they need to be arrested, and they need to be stopped. We must confront and hold the conversations necessary to confront this injustice, inequality, anguish, and suffering that discrimination and intolerance, racism, and violent reactions has created in America to make things like Rondo happen. And there are 4 chances for a community like ours, I see, that they can take, the steps that they can take in order to make sure that we continue to live in the greatest country in the world. Number 1, you need to read and have whole discussion groups with Whiteness in Plain View, written by Dr. Chad Moultrie, to get an understanding that if I tell you things are bad, you may or may not believe me. But if you hear it from somebody who has documented his book with extensive notes, exhaustive research, and has written it in a clear and compelling style, believe it. What he says in that book is exactly as I see happened here in Minnesota, and it provides a nice roadmap for you to start your work. Or 2, you can do what a group of friends that I've met recently have started to do under the name of Hey White People. Is Clover here? There's Clover Earl. She leads a group called Hey White People. We have work to do. And their premise is that it's not all on you. It's not on the African American community to come and do all of the heavy lifting on this, all of the marching on this. White people, we are the ones that understand this. We have work to do. It is in our homes. It is with our children that talk that the African American community has with its young people, they can have it with their own young people and get them to understand that black and white and Asians and immigrants aren't the slums, aren't the people that you have to be afraid of. It's these thoughts and these perceptions of us as a superior race that we need to deal with. And if all else fails, the last thing that you can do, or maybe not do, or what I don't want to happen, is the opening line in Mohsin Mohammed's new work called The Last White Man. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find that he had turned a deep and undeniable brown shade. And the rest of the book details what happens to poor Anders when he finds out that that pigmentation is there to stay. An excellent book, just like Whiteness in Plain View is an excellent book, just like Rondo is trying to recapture some of the values and glory it has. And hopefully people like you, people like this, who in this audience, will stay in touch with us as we continue on this journey to make a new community in the Rondo. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right, good morning. We're getting close to afternoon at this point, right? I want to thank Mr. Marvin Anderson for his comments. The book that I wrote is something that took a lot of work, a lot of research and writing, and having someone who knows so thoroughly the history of Rondo and is so involved in the important things going on there right now, say the things he said about the book, in particular the chapter on Rondo, makes me feel like the book was worthwhile. All that work was worthwhile. And so I very much appreciate the comments that he made in introducing what is going to be a conversation, hopefully. Once I get done with my comments, we're going to sit down and let you make some remarks of your own and ask us some questions. I also want to thank Akoma for putting this together. This is the second time I have worked with her in doing a book talk, and it has been a privilege to do that. I really couldn't ask for somebody better as far as trying to get everything together and getting audience here and getting us set up on a beautiful stage like this. And everyone else at the History Center, also the people at the Minnesota Historical Society, who are part of the collective effort to bring this book into being. And this is kind of a final landing for this book. I did a book talk tour in April when the book came out, but I didn't do a talk here. And when I finished my manuscript, it was in the sort of the very beginning of COVID. So I was working with editors virtually, and I'm finally meeting these people now. But Anne Regan and Joss Leventhal, also Shannon Penfeather, they were very important in what you see as the final version of this. I didn't do this alone. I didn't make this book all by myself. Laura Weber also was very important in helping me find the press when I wrote the article about Duluth that Akoma referred to, and then I got in touch with people here. And Allison Ayton, who's the marketing director here at the press, has been great to work with as far as promoting the book. It's now common to do a land acknowledgement at public events, and for Minnesota, of course, pointing out the fact that Dakota, Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, and others were original occupants and stewards of the land that we're on. I also think it's important, I've seen this done, but I want to make sure that we also say something about what happened. Just doing a land acknowledgement and talking about who were original occupants and stewards is another way of kind of covering up the past, right? If you don't mention also that they were displaced by white traders and soldiers and missionaries and settler colonists, that they orchestrated a long history of genocide and removal. And in fact, that's really the first racial exclusion in the state of Minnesota. And it's the historical context and the background for what happened to African Americans later as they showed up in the years following the Civil War. I'm going to say a few things about where the book came from, how I got it. Everyone asks me, why did you decide to study Minnesota? I'm not from Minnesota. I'm from Kentucky. I teach in Massachusetts. Why would I study Minnesota? I'm going to explain a little bit about that because that also helps give you a sense of why I do what I do in the book, including why I say the things I say in the chapter 6 on Rondo. The place I grew up in Kentucky was in the eastern part of Jefferson County, just outside of Louisville, the big city. And I grew up in a subdivision called Plainview. So the title of the book is kind of a play on that name. This was a subdivision that was, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, all white. So I grew up in an all-white place. That was sort of my formative experience as a kid. One of the exceptions in the neighborhood, however, was the Rice family. They lived directly across the street from our house. And I can tell you in our neighborhood, almost all of the kids, we all went to the same schools. We had the same teachers. We played sports together. We went in and out of each other's houses during the summertime. The adults socialized together. Sometimes they'd block off a street and do a block party. And the Rice family never participated in any of this. I didn't know any of the kids in the Rice family. There was a son in the family, Butch, who was my age. I never played with him. I played with every other kid, and I never knew him. When I started working on this book, I did get in touch with him, and we talked about his experience, and it was, he said, very hard. When I was a kid, lacking anything like a racial consciousness, the question that I had was, why is the Rice family there? Why is there a black family in our neighborhood? And why are they so isolated? Why are they so reserved? Why don't they come out and do things with us? Why doesn't Butch come over and knock on the door and ask if we wanted to go play? that was how I thought about my situation. Unfortunately, I started to get involved with some social activists in the city. Many of them had deep roots in the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and the 60s, including Ann Braden, and they began to explain to me the history of segregation in Kentucky and in the South and in other parts of the country, and that helped reframe my personal experience, and I got a better understanding of who the Rice family was and what it might be like for the Rice family to be there, and also why my subdivision was otherwise all white. I went to college and also found some professors who came out of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, not only the civil rights movement, but anti-war, women's rights, women's liberation, and they had this idea that you could be an academic and go into academia and use scholarship, use teaching, and use things that you publish to help change the world, that you could make change in the present. And that was the model for me in terms of the kind of writing I do, like Whiteness in Plain View. I did graduate school and then finished that in 2001 and went to Memphis for a year. And I was looking around the neighborhood where the college was, and I decided that I'd talk about or sort of investigate the history of that neighborhood in terms of racial exclusion, that I would study how segregation had played out there, and then connect it to what the implications that might have for Black residents' exposure to environmental hazards and toxic waste. So I was an environmental historian at the time. I started training to be both a labor environmental historian and wanted to see sort of what it might mean for us to consider things like racism as a part of understanding our environmental history, including people's exposure to things that are environmental hazards and what they might do in terms of environmental activism. But I didn't really continue with the racial exclusion as a focus for the next decade and a half or so. I was doing something else. And I came back, but I decided to come back around to it. I decided that I'd reshift my research. And one of the things that pushed me back to racial exclusion was what happened in the summer of 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, when white police officer Darren Wilson killed African-American Michael Brown. And as an historian, what I wanted to know, not only sort of the details of what was going on that day or that week in terms of these two individuals, or maybe even just sort of that year, like what kind of tensions are in the air, but what's the history of that area, right? And other people had already had these same kinds of questions, and what I found by reading their work was that there's a history of racial exclusion in that part of St. Louis County that kind of explains why Darren Wilson and Michael Brown did what they did that day. There's a community called Kinloch right next to Ferguson that had been an African-American community, and those Black residents were displaced by an airport expansion. Similar to what we're talking about with Rondo, there's government action that moves African-Americans out of one area, and many of those people from Kinloch, those African-American residents, moved into Ferguson, which up to that point had been an all-white place by intent. White people had done everything they could to keep Ferguson all white. But starting in the 1980s and into the 21st century, there are more and more African-American residents there until you have about a two-third black majority in 2014. And yet, white people had not relinquished control of government. They controlled all of the city government positions and 47 of the 50 police officers in Ferguson at the time. In a place that's two-thirds African-American, all 47 of those 50 police officers were white. And so what I understood from that is that when Darren Wilson confronted Michael Brown that day, it's not just two individuals. These are historical forces confronting one another. And when Darren Wilson was not convicted of a crime, that wasn't just an individual miscarriage of justice, that was something else much larger taking place. That basically solidified for me that I wanted to look at racial exclusion as a topic. But I also did know. I grew up in Louisville, in Kentucky, in a southern state. I'd been in Memphis and did some research on racial exclusion in Tennessee, a southern state. I knew now something about Missouri, a southern state, but I didn't want to just tell a story about the South. I wanted to be part of a conversation that was happening among scholars and others about how segregation mattered also in the North. And looked around, asked some questions, managed to get in touch with Jim Loewen, who wrote some great books, including Sundown Towns. He had studied various states, not only in the South, but also in the North. I asked him, well, what would be a good case for me to look at? And not knowing anything, as I said, about Minnesota, he immediately said Minnesota, because he said, especially for white people there in that state and other parts of the country, it will be counterintuitive for them, that they will not expect that Minnesota has such an important thread of racism, and such an important part of its history is about racism. And you'll be then demonstrating not only something about Minnesota, but also about the country as a whole. So I started doing research. I came here, spent several weeks and different summers doing working with archival materials at the History Center, also in Edina, in Austin, in Duluth. And I pieced together a story, a narrative about Minnesota, and then discovered basically that you could really look at just about any suburb, any town, any city, and you will find this. And so what I had to do is find the most compelling stories, put them together, and what you have then are several chapters that go from chapter 3 to the end, telling you something about a different part of Minnesota at a different moment in time and in a different place. And each of those chapters also, what they do is reveal various methods, because there are different methods in different moments that whites use. Sometimes to block African Americans from coming to a community so that communities that were all white stay all white. Sometimes removing African Americans where they are to make a community white, and then doing things to maintain that. Or if they can't remove all of the African Americans that are in their community, figuring out ways to contain them, to draw a strict color line in terms of housing and in terms of jobs. What I found, and Marvin Anderson said this to you, and I think it's worth repeating, is that racial exclusion in Minnesota and elsewhere is not accidental. It is very intentional, and that's key for us to understand that people do this on purpose. And when they do exclusion, and white people create a white community, they have to do a lot of work to maintain that whiteness. It doesn't just stay that way, right? They have to keep policing the boundaries of their white community. The other thing is, as I just sort of suggested, that what racial exclusion is not incidental. I don't have to pick exceptional stories, places that are outliers in an otherwise progressive history of Minnesota. I am just telling a few of the stories, right? And this is really what Minnesota's past is, and that it has a lot to do then also with why Minnesota is what it is in the present time. So primary sources are a critical part of the historical interpretation I put together. It is not fiction, right? In my free time, I don't tend to read history because I do enough history, and I teach history, and I read novels, and I read short stories, and those are fiction. And those things can tell us truths about the human experience, right? But they're different from a history book. The book that I wrote is based on work with primary sources. I am presenting historical facts, and I assemble those together and make an interpretation, but that interpretation is grounded in evidence. Anyone here, anyone else not here in this room is welcome to challenge what I have to say about racial exclusion, but they have to do it with their own evidence. They have to do it with their own sources. You can't just dismiss this book and say it's not true. You have to tell me why it's not true. You have to explain and prove why these facts don't line up the way that I claim that they do. And that'll maybe come up when we do some Q&A in terms of talking about critical race theory, because I have this theory about the theory, that the reason why people are pushing so hard in making that the thing to debate is because somehow theory is more malleable, that people can debate theory, and they don't want to debate historical facts, right? They don't want a book like this because they don't know what to do with the facts, right? But they can say that people just, can believe whatever theory they want, and that kids shouldn't have to be getting exposed to theory. But we can get to that a little later. A lot of the best sources, and I recommend this if you're an historian or interested in just doing some historical work, a lot of the best sources for this book were here at the History Center. I spent a lot of time at the Gale Library looking at printed sources, looking at oral history collections, newspapers, archival collections, and the things that I found there sometimes were not surprising. It was like they're sometimes just very obvious, sort of representations of what I would expect. Sometimes what I found was very complicated, and it took me a while to work through what I was seeing. The Rondo chapter I felt was like that. The sources that I had, it took me a long time to sort of juggle them and figure out how that they would come together as a narrative. Also because there's a lot of detail there, and I just wanted to make sure that the story was accurate. And sometimes things are elusive, and I didn't find answers to questions that I went into archives with, and that's still somewhat true. One thing that may help me answer some of those questions, and some of you also may be thinking about this, is that we just have seen the opening of the 1950 census manuscripts, right? And there are some secrets in that manuscript, in those manuscripts. There are things that I can now say, probably with reference to evidence, by going in to the manuscript, and I will be doing that sometime soon. So I'm going to also show some slides. I'm just adding to what Marvin showed you in terms of the history of Rondo. One thing I do want to note is that there's another displacement that happens before the highway construction that comes as a result of an urban renewal project. In fact, there are two significant major urban renewal projects in the area around Rondo. So in Rondo proper, people are affected, and in the area around Rondo, people are affected, moving both black and white residents out of their apartments and their homes. And this is a project map from the 1950s for the first urban renewal projects that the St. Paul Housing Redevelopment Authority were going to do. And so you can see on one side the eastern redevelopment area, the Mount Airy redevelopment area, and then a western redevelopment area on the other side of the Capitol, which is also where Rondo is. And, sorry. As Marvin also mentioned, this area is the place where you have the largest concentration of African American population, not only in St. Paul, but in the Twin Cities, right? But the other thing, and I'll sort of add to that point, is that it's also the most integrated, racially integrated part of St. Paul and in the Twin Cities. So when Rondo is destroyed, when this area is sort of hammered by urban renewal and highway expansion, it isn't just that African Americans were affected, but also it's the one place where you do actually have racial integration, including sometimes in people's homes. There's actual interracial relationships, interracial marriage, and children of those relationships, and people living next door to one another. And they know what the boundaries are for their area. They know that if they cross those boundaries, that whatever racial tolerance that they might experience in Rondo is not going to exist beyond like Lexington Parkway, right? And so that's also something that was destroyed. People do fight back against the urban renewal project, the first one that happens in the 1950s, including Reverend Davis, whose home was in the way. He's sort of the last one standing. He refuses to leave his home. This is a newspaper article from 1956, and it's talking about how he's saying, I will not leave, that I've been here this long, and I don't necessarily care about my house so much, but I care about this land, and this is my land. And the city does everything it can to encourage him to leave. They try to entice him out of his home, and when he refuses, then they basically send people in to force him out. They send police in, they send other city officials in, they take him and his family, his wife, and all of his belongings, and they move him to an apartment. They dump all of his belongings at the bottom of some stairs and leave him to have to figure out how to carry them all up into the apartment. His grandson later came home from school that day, went to the house where Reverend Davis was living, where his grandfather was living, and he saw men knocking all the walls down with sledgehammers. But he said they weren't doing that because they were beginning to demolish the house, to build something else there, but they were doing that so no one could come back and occupy it, right? So it was real violence. There's a violence that is part of it that isn't just about like trying to raise a structure so that there can be some kind of new development project there. And people realize that things are going wrong in terms of the urban renewal effort. This is a newspaper article from November of 1957, and the title is Housing Project Hit as Failure. Although generally successful, St. Paul's Western redevelopment project was in one respect, quote, a complete and total failure. City Housing and Redevelopment Director Warner Shippey told the St. Paul Council of Human Relations Thursday. An overwhelming majority of Negro families relocated by the project were forced to move into non-white districts, Mr. Shippey said. It was awfully tough to find rentals in other areas where non-white families were welcome, he said. This unwillingness to permit Negroes into other sections of the city will create even more problems of housing as the new freeway system is begun. So this is the other part of the story. Yes, the city is behind the displacement, the state as well, and to some, eventually federal government money is also involved in displacement. But it isn't just city, state, and federal policy that explains the displacement or what happens to African Americans. It's also the fact that when they are forced out, that, as Marvin Anderson said, they don't have a full range of choices to go somewhere else, right? Unlike white residents who are displaced in Rondo, they can't just go anywhere. In fact, they're going to face a lot of significant discrimination and white prejudice, which is outside of city, state, and federal policy. It's happening alongside that policy. And so blacks are actually concentrated in an ever smaller area within Rondo, around the Selby and Dale Street area. Shippey says, well, if this is how it's going to happen, he said, passage of a city housing code and the proposed open occupancy ordinance is both desirable and necessary. Without them, he said, schools will be segregated by geography and children will grow up prejudice. The open occupancy ordinance would make it a misdemeanor to refuse to rent or sell property to a person solely on the basis of race. So the head of the St. Paul Housing Redevelopment Authority is saying, after they've started to see what happens with displacement in terms of blacks not being able to find alternatives, that there needs to be a fair housing bill, a legislation passed at the city level, and eventually we'll see at the state level. Otherwise, you're going to have what happened, which is more segregation. The urban renewal causing more segregation, and then the freeway project added to that. This is, I'm going to sort of, what we'll do is we'll go around the audience and everyone has to read a line of this, right? And then we won't go to the next slide until you get it right. Even I can't read this. Now, I could read this when I was closer to the screen, but this is, the St. Paul Housing and Redevelopment Authority records are amazing, and I spent a long time working with them. They recorded what they were doing and put them in files, and it's there for people to see. And they did things to think about what happened to people in terms of race. And this is a document detailing the number of people that lived in this area where the urban renewal project is going to happen, who are white, as well as who are black, families as well as individuals, and then what happened to them in terms of what kind of new housing did they find when they left. And there's also things like this map. The black dots are people that are displaced from Rondo, moving somewhere else, and the open triangles, which maybe you can see are African Americans that are displaced, and you can see the black dots, white people, those are getting scattered, right? Those are going to other parts of St. Paul, including Frogtown, other parts of St. Paul, as well as Minneapolis, and some people are going to suburbs, and the white triangles are not moving very far, right? Those white triangles are African-American families and individuals. Those are people getting displaced and basically staying just somewhere else nearby a few blocks away, right? Making clear that you're having more segregation. And the title of Chapter 6, and this is something that Marvin referenced, comes from Leonard Carter, who was the branch president of the NAACP at the time. He said, residents were confined, and he's referring to the Urban Renewal Project. This is before the highway construction. Residents were confined to relocation, quote, in the fringe areas of the so-called ghetto by a vicious vice of policy and prejudice. And it's important to keep that in mind to understand the complexity of how racism works, that it isn't just the city and the state and the federal government, but also white people who are not being forced by a government to do what they do, but are acting in a prejudicial way to block African Americans from moving into what they had wanted to be all white communities. People do try to work on this, including Josie Johnson, who almost single-handedly gets fair housing legislation passed at the state level in Minnesota. She's the one that got a bill out of committee where it was stuck in 1961, and then the legislature passed it. It went into effect in 1962, and it gives African Americans some protection, and others some protection in terms of renting and buying homes. There are some exceptions to the rentals and housing purchases that make the legislation somewhat weak. But it is an advance. It is a step forward. It picks up on what Shippey was saying. And there's now a state agency by 1962 that's supposed to enforce the law. And so those records for SCAD are also in the History Center in the library. And you can look at that, including people making claims of discrimination and then what happens in terms of follow-up. And so I looked actually at people who are getting forced out of Rondo and what happened to them and what kind of experiences they had, what kind of discrimination they faced. And it's insidious. People go to rent an apartment, and when they show up, the white property owner says, oh, well, actually, we already rented the apartment. Or, you know what, I need you to give me a character reference, and then I'll call you back, right? And they never call them back. There are all sorts of things that they're doing that are basically outside of the law or contravening the law, and realtors get involved too, and they'll steer African Americans away from some neighborhoods into others, basically refuse to show them houses. So realtors are implicated as well, along with property owners. And this is despite the fact that there's now state legislation by 1962. Also, there is, by 1968, federal fair housing legislation. The Fair Housing Act was passed, and that closed all the loopholes in the state legislation in Minnesota and elsewhere. And then, of course, we also remember that even before that, there was the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948, which made racial restrictive covenants that are in people's deeds unenforceable by the state courts. So you have a Supreme Court case taking restrictive covenants away as tools for whites. You have legislation passed by the state taking away some of the things that whites could do legally, taking some of that away from whites. And then you have federal legislation in 1968 taking some of the things that whites could do away from them. And yet, into the 1960s and 70s, you still have segregation, right? You still have racial exclusion. White people simply do other things. They use other methods. They always find a way to do racial exclusion. And that's somewhat captured here in this excerpt from the Metropolitan Council of the Twin Cities report from 1970. The Twin Cities metropolitan area, despite its northern location and progressive reputation, has highly segregated living patterns as a result of housing discrimination. Minorities, particularly blacks and Indians, are concentrated in a few core city neighborhoods, and as a group live in some of the worst housing in the region. It seems clear that a significant constraint operating to prevent minority persons from being more adequately housed and from having more choice in residential locations, in addition to their generally lower incomes, is a pattern of housing discrimination which exists in the area. And this is, well, I don't have the map there. And of course, in the epilogue, I continue to look at some of the demographic changes taking place or not taking place. I make this point, and I think I like the fact that we're using Chapter 6 and focus on Rondo here today, because some of you also probably have read the book Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And in that book, which I appreciate what he's done, and it's really energized discussion about racial exclusion, he says very explicitly at the beginning, I'm going to prove to you or show to you how everything is about the state, how every example of racial exclusion, how all racial exclusion actually comes back to state action. And he says he does that in order to make the case for reparations stronger. If you can show it's the state that's responsible for racial exclusion, then you can show the state's responsible for making reparations. I see what he's doing, but I think that simplifies history in a way that's a little dangerous. I want that we look at the complexity of how white racism is manifested, how racial exclusion happened, because only then are we going to be able to put together something like a reckoning or a truth and reconciliation effort and reparations that speak to that complexity, right? And I note at the end of the introduction in the book, even now, after George Floyd's murder and the public protest it ignited, many readers will be surprised that racial hatred and racial inequality have been such a fundamental part of Minnesota's past. But Whiteness in Plain View reveals the way long-standing assumptions about regional distinctions based on race are off the mark, if not a lie. And that raises fundamental questions about the country as a whole. The ghosts of racial exclusion are all around us. If they are in Minnesota, they are everywhere, wherever we are. And that's all I'm going to do in terms of comments. I think we're going to try to have some conversation and Q&A. Be happy to sit over in the chair and see what you have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Raise your hand, and we will give you a microphone if you have any questions.
Okay. I'm good. I drank mine.
Or maybe if there are any questions that that you've been asked before that you found the answers to be, or questions you have for each other, we could start there if people are shy.
No, we need them.
Hello. I was privileged to read the book, and I wrote several book reviews.
It's the most amazing book review that I've had.
Oh, thanks.
Is it
no,
the deepest read that I've seen somebody?
Maybe too deep. So, no, the question I have is that I thought was very interesting in the Rondo chapter, and I'm sure you could run a vein in the other chapters, the other locations in the book, but ways in which the real estate industry, real estate agents, and so forth, the incentivization that they receive. I found that this structure of incentivizing individuals really contributed to a lot of the motivation, at least in Rondo, but in other places as well. And today we didn't talk, so I had a question, that's the one question I had. And it seems to me that the two main poles that this book got at, and you mentioned it, was housing and employment discrimination. We talked less about employment discrimination, I think, in the discussion today. That's just a comment. But I would like for you to talk a little bit more in detail about how the con game or the incentivizing structure worked in terms of real estate with the Rondo situation. Thank you.
Do you want to talk about that in terms of the equity?
The real estate industry, you've heard of the History Theater here in St. Paul, Minnesota History Theater. They did a play on a real estate agent that sold a home to a black couple from Rondo. He actually pretended that the couple from Rondo were not black, weren't African American, and he sold a house, and they got into the house, and once they got into the house in an all-white neighborhood, he was kicked out of the real estate agency. He lost his license. He went up for his license, and this History Theater program play was about the aftermath of him, and the play talks about all of the mechanisms and misrepresentations that he said he could not do as a professional and as a human being. So it's a very interesting play, and it's a true story because it was written by his daughter, and they're talking about when they lost the job, they lost their friends, they had to move themselves because his livelihood was gone, and how depressed her father became because the real estate industry went after him for doing something that he thought was right. And so all sort of subterfuge was used to keep African Americans away from areas where they wanted to move. And as Chad has said, the real sadness about this is that was going on in 1955, 56, 57, and it's still going on today. There was an article in the newspaper in Cold Spring, Minnesota. Maybe some of you saw it. An African-American couple had moved into a neighborhood, and for some reason, another person ran his car into the house because he felt that the African-American family that
his girlfriend or his wife had fallen in love with an African American man because he's in this neighborhood. And he took it upon himself to run his car into the house. So that's kind of frightening in a way, that that's still going on, that exclusion, that's still happening. And that story of the History Theater that is still happening today, and that's why the work needs to be done, as Clover and her group is. They're the ones where the work needs to be done. I can tell you about all these horror stories, but that work needs to be done in the real estate agency itself. The incentive to treat people as human beings isn't strong. And it needs to get stronger if we're ever going to get out of this madness.
Well, I think that also there's like the tip of the iceberg in the book about how realtors are involved in helping to orchestrate racial exclusion. I think there's a lot that could be done by people to look at not only the Twin Cities but Minnesota more broadly and in other parts of the country at specifically who did what. There are specifics in the archives, in collections, like in different records of what real estate company was doing what real estate agent was doing what. They professionalized themselves in the 1920s, and one of the things that they do and enforce among one another is to make sure that they abide by the idea of not having people of color be brought into what they think of as white communities, and that's just basically how they think about their job, is that they are helping to maintain the boundaries, right? And they do this. They're out on the front line of that, and you see specific examples of it in various parts of the Twin Cities and the suburbs, in the chapter I do on Edina and Bloomington, and they actually go back and forth on what they're gonna and how they feel about fair housing legislation. When they don't think it's going to be passed, then they say, okay, so don't worry about it, and continue to operate as usual. And they try to make the case that it doesn't need to happen, though. At the same time that they're actually doing racist real estate transactions, they'll say, well, yes, it's true. There should be a chance for blacks to rent apartments or move into homes everywhere, but that's just going to need education. We don't need a coercive law to do that. Or they'll sometimes even align themselves with the people saying, well, if you pass fair housing legislation, that takes white people's rights away, because then they don't have the right to sell their property to who they want to. And so there's a real, this is like, like the industry's culture, and this is something that industry has a lot to do with. And so I guess it's a long way around to saying, like, they have something to do to reckon with, and that there are people. And I hope this book does this generally, is that this makes it very clear that white people are culpable and they're responsible right now. Like, just because you're alive in the 21st century doesn't mean that you're not responsible for something in the past. In fact, the thing is, you can draw some direct lines back to the recent past in the 1960s and 70s. Some of the people in the book are still alive, or some of the people that are alive definitely gained a lot, have some advantages in their life as a result of generational wealth or whatever it might be, because of what people did recently. And so reparations isn't just a theoretical thing. Like, we can actually say, and as I think this was a brilliant part of the slides that you put up, Marvin, showing those numbers, right? What we are talking about in terms of the wealth gap and where that came from, and what are we going to do about it? Not just talk about it, but what are we going to do about it to fix the wrongs that were done, right?
Can I just add that we work with the St. Paul Area Association of Realtors, SPAR, and I don't want to leave the impression that all real estate agents, are engaged in these practices. There are some, of course. There's something in every professional group. But they are making a concerted effort to try to change the structure and of the organization, and bring in people of color that can sell homes and then be that person that can be the agent for a person and get them home, because homes are so important to the African American community and other communities as well. That was the only asset. That was it. That was the way in which that promise was made. That promise was made to your children. When I get that home, I'm going to give it to you, and that was taken away. But real estate agents played a part in taking it away, and I believe that they're on the right track to rebuild that reputation. It's a wonderful profession, but they need to work on it. And when they work on it, I'll be the first to tell them, good job.
Well, I would just add also to that other point you made about employment. So I did a talk in Austin on Thursday, and one of the things I do in the Austin chapter is to show how the racial exclusion that whites accomplished in Austin after the 1922 railroad shopmen strike, which means that there are only about 6 black residents in Austin for the next 6 or 7 decades, in a population that grows to about 28,000. When they organize Hormel and they have good union-paying jobs with benefits, allowing whites to have a certain type of social and economic mobility, there are no black employees at Hormel. And when you look at pictures of the strike from 1985-86, all white people on the picket line, because it's still in 1985 and 86, there are no black workers in Hormel. So they're being shut out of, not only like, are we talking about like home equity as a thing that is denied through racial exclusion, but racial exclusion also means lack of access to things like that, like a union job. And that'll have an impact over the course of several generations that shows up now today in terms of disparities of education, incarceration, home ownership, whatever it might be. Those things don't just, again, happen by accident. They're a result of things that happened in the past.
No accidents.
I just wanted to ask if you're aware of change in Minneapolis and the realtor industry, because it's just by serendipity, I was able to talk with an African-American couple that work very closely at the University of Minnesota, and he's a realtor, and she's part of the medical school advising, and their concerted effort is to place African-American new doctors coming out of the university in proper housing, and he shared the struggles in Minneapolis about, and these are highly educated kids that spend a lot of time getting their work done and cannot get always access. So I know you're familiar with St. Paul. I was wondering what kind of oversight or accountability there are for that industry when these things happen.
Well, it's against the law, and there are a lot more ways for that to be, for people to challenge that kind of discrimination in the practices. But realtors got really good over a century of doing this, as you said, subterfuge or deceitful. Like, there's ways that this happens behind the scenes, and white people can collude with one another too to get around the laws. But I don't really know. I think that's really a question maybe for you, Marvin. It's somebody probably more aware of what's going on currently.
Yeah, it gets back to the mindset of the people who are actually doing it, and that's where those conversations need to be held to get them to change. How do you change a person's mind if they've been given ideas over a century of time that some people are superior to other people? No law can change that. If they inherently believe that I am superior to you, in body, mind, and soul, I am superior to you. And therefore, nothing can stop you. Nothing can stop me from doing what I think is inherent within my right to treat you any way that I want. And denying you access to a home or living in my community or driving my car into your house no matter who I hurt, is my prerogative, am I right? And there seems to be a celebration of violence, of threats, of people calling. And I've read in the paper today, I'm reading the paper, librarians are being called. There's a threat, they're saying that they've received more threats this year than they've ever had in the American library history because they have books in their library. Teachers are being threatened. Real estate agents, schools, you just name it. People are being threatened. FBI, police officers. The whole system of justice is being threatened because there's this idea and this mindset that this is the way things should be, and I'm ready to do whatever I can to the law be damned. So how do you get into that mindset? How do you change that so that things are in the American way?
I will say one thing.
Okay.
There is an organization in Minneapolis, the City of Lakes Land Trust. So folks who own homes can sell their home to the land trust at a very reduced rate, and then they give those homes to folks who make, I believe, 50% less than the median income of the neighborhood. So they get it at an equitable rate. And most of these recipients are first-time home buyers as well. But that's a great entryway, I think, into building home equity. So if you see some of these organizations, yep.
That's a very good point, because we have a Rondo Land Trust here in St. Paul. It's called the Rondo Land Trust. And they will represent the housing on the land bridge, about 300 homes. They'll be sold by the Rondo Land Trust so that when a purchaser comes, the purchaser actually is buying from the land trust. And then when the person leaves, they resell their home back to the land trust, and they split whatever profit in order to stop gentrification and just people coming in for profit. And then if the land bridge is reality, they'll sell high and then they'll leave. But if we can do what we want to do, all of the homes will be sold by the land trust. You repair it, you keep it going, and then when you leave, you sell it back to the land trust, and then we qualify another buyer. So steps can be made, but in the final analysis, it gets right down to there comes a moment in each transaction when I can do the right thing, and what happens if I do the right thing. And if they decide that it just doesn't work, no amount of plead, no amount of asking you or pleading with you is going to change that mind if that mindset is there. That's what we're up against at times.
I got a question, or comment first. I think one of the things we have to have for an integrated society is have authentic relationships. Chad, you mentioned that Butch Rice never came to knock on your door. Did you ever consider going to his door to knock on it?
No.
And what would have been the repercussions if you had?
I don't know what the repercussions would have been, but it never occurred to me as a white person, right? And it's part of where I started in terms of thinking about writing this book. Like acknowledging the whiteness of the neighborhood that I grew up in, like actually seeing it. And that's to me, like the title of the book contains a lot of what it's about, which is white people seeing what is actually around them. Now in a way that wasn't true when I was a kid, like when I am in an all-white space or predominantly all-white space, it makes me nervous because I know that doesn't happen on its own, that is a result of people doing something very much on purpose. And I mean, as an historian, of course, I want to know what it's about. But as just a human being living in society, I also wonder, well, what is, you know, what is that? What implications does that have for people's safety? You know, what people can say. And I'm a white person. What about people of color? How do they feel in those spaces, right? If they do find their way into those spaces. So, you know, there's, yeah, I mean, it's like, it's something we're all, like, I feel like I thought I knew a lot about American history from the bottom up, as we say, in sort of the you know, the new labor, new social history sort of approach. But I feel like I'm a different person after having written this book, including having done some thinking of my own. Also learned a lot more about Native American history than I ever knew, and the editors that I worked with, Ann and Josh, helped me do that. I feel like that was transformative in a very important way. So I had a lot to learn too, as I would imagine the readers of the book will, white people.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You ever thought about doing a sequel to each of the cities itself? You give a little bit of information about Austin, but Bloomington, Edina.
Yeah, I tried to do that a little in the epilogue, but I'm not a demographer, and what I would like to see happen is that somebody who is or knows how to do the kind of work that has to be done. You can look at some of the census and other population statistics, and what I suspect is happening, when you see African Americans showing up in places that they weren't before in the 1980s and 90s, you're also seeing a huge number of white people leaving those areas. And what I'm suspecting is happening is that blacks are simply just moving into a part of that area and whites are moving away, and it's not integration that's happening. And it's not necessarily meaning that people are moving into a community where now blacks have access to the resources that whites have monopolized and denied to blacks, that you're just seeing changes on the ground in terms of where people live. But you can't really know that with at least the research that I was able to do. I think there's other people that know how to do this kind of demographic stuff, and that would be a great study. Again, like I keep recommending things that people should do instead of myself, but it would take a special skill set to see this in a more at a lower level beyond the census tract, but below the census tract, below maybe even you know, the towns and suburbs, right, like that.
That would be interesting.
And I think that'll just show, I mean, I mean, we know this, right, that the Twin Cities are among the most segregated in the country, but we need to know that more specifically. What does that mean, right? And how was that happening over the course of 2 decades from the 1990s into the 21st century?
Interesting.
So talking about white Minnesotans' ways of denying their sort of what they really mean. I mean, like, I think there's a bigger question you're asking there, but I can start with something very specific. You know, I follow, like, I do read the Star Tribune and other, you know, the Edina newspaper in Duluth and Austin. Like, I follow what's going on here from afar, and I know, you know, there's this effort to extend the light rail out to White Bear Lake, right? And what the people say in White Bear Lake, white people, is that they don't want their small town feel of White Bear Lake to be ruined. That's not what's going on, right? It's very clear what's going on, and yet people aren't necessarily, you know, they're not having an honest conversation about what's at stake. White people wanting to keep, you know, others from coming into their community. Instead, it's, you know, about, you know, what kind of changes it might bring to downtown White Bear Lake or whatever. Those, you could confront the people that are saying those things and say, well, what do you know, well, I know what you're really saying. There's other things like land use zoning, which is a tool that whites developed in the early part of the 20th century, which seems to not be about race, but really is a way to keep African Americans and other people of color out of communities that whites have managed to make all white. And those continues to be a legal tool to, you know, to define what like Edina or another community might look like. Though people could challenge land use zoning and say that there can't be prohibition on multifamily housing, right? And that would be a way of beginning to undo racial exclusion, a long history of racial exclusion. I don't know if that's entirely like the passive aggressive, like it's a hidden way that people continue to practice racial exclusion we can call people out on it and actually take the tool away from them and see what happens as a result. But
Chad mentions it in his book. An interracial community can work. Interracial communities can work. People live together, they celebrate together, they talk. Rondo, for a large portion of it, was integrated. When he said integrated, top to bottom, it was probably the largest, most integrated community in the state of Minnesota was in Rondo. And they wouldn't let that stand. So why? We've always wanted to know that, what was so bad about it? To call it a slum was an indictment that was not at all the reality of the majority of Rondo. Mm-hmm. To tell people that they were living in slum back in the 50s was a pejorative word. I mean, it carried a lot of sway, and they could say you couldn't get a loan because you lived in that neighborhood, the precursor of redlining, you live in a slum area. Well, that stuck with us. And, but there were so many whites, Native Americans in Rondo that lived, worked, played, rode the bus. The Johnson kids across the street from me and my brother. And they introduced me to curling. I mean, I was 6 years old. I went to a curling club. Talk about a white sport. That's it. So, I learned all of this because the Johnsons lived across the street from me. And so integrated communities can work. The people who feel like they don't work, or they have to live in an all-white community or all that, don't understand the power of people to get to know each other, to share with each other, is greater than the exclusion of people. We just got to trust in that.
Thank you both. Excuse me. Thank you both for coming today and speaking with us. I was going to ask two questions. I'll only ask one. I think I should hold the microphone away. Dr. Muntry, as you were doing your research, did you find how white communities justified this behavior, how we justified this behavior to ourselves, how we justified the necessity of racial segregation, how we argued that integration was not possible or desirable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. They certainly do. Another part of the book is to illuminate the stories that white people tell themselves, and then to explain what they're doing without it being about their racism, and then how they misremember the past or forget the past or misremember the past, as sort of using memory in a sense as a tool to maintain racial exclusion without them thinking that they're doing it, right? They'll also do other things like claim that black people can't afford to move into their wealthy suburb, even though they have racial restrictive covenants in the deed saying black people can't buy the house, right? So while they say that black people simply can't afford to do that, they know some black people can, and so they'll have a tool to prevent that, at least until 1948. Or they'll do other things like they'll reinforce their own racism in ways that it is about explaining to themselves why blacks shouldn't be in their communities. So they do minstrel shows well into the 1950s and 60s, blackface minstrel shows, which portray African Americans in these ridiculous racist caricatures, as these backward Southern plantation field hands. And white people in blackface doing that is basically saying this is what black people are like, and that's, in their mind they walk out of the theater and it's adults, it's kids, it's men, it's women, it's everybody in a community doing this, saying to themselves, well, and we're different, right? And we're the urban modern North, and we're white people, and that's why we don't have these people in our community, and it wouldn't make sense for them to show up there, right? But it's a very complicated thing that white people are doing, and sometimes they're really good at fooling themselves. I went to Austin on Thursday, and there are a group of people that are fairly progressive who formed the Austin Committee on Human Rights. in 1960s, and they talked to various people that are associated with state-level anti-discrimination agencies that are supposed to stop housing and employment discrimination, and they tell them, like, look, we've done our study, and they say this very explicitly in a report that I have. There are only 2 black families in Austin, and they've never had any problem finding housing, so therefore we don't have a race problem. But we do have religious conflict, and we want to look into that, right? Totally missing the whiteness in front of them, as I was saying, like a white person just incapable of seeing it. So those are progressive white liberal people. Helen McMillan, who was the first woman to represent that area to the state legislature, who does all kinds of other progressive things in terms of environment and poverty. She's among those people saying, I don't see any problem in terms of racism here in Austin. Right? So yeah, that's the case.
Okay, I was going to ask 3 questions, but because we're lacking time,
this is like an academic conference at this point. And you have to refer to your own research first.
No. I'll just ask one question. When you look at all what you have discussed, and I find it really very interesting, do you think that there's any, capitalism is very productive, it is very efficient, this has been documented in history, but capitalism can also divide people just as it can unite them. Do you think inside capitalism it has some ethical and moral commitment to the kind of thing, to achieve the kind of things that you're trying to bring about? Because if it doesn't have inherent in it a certain moral and ethical commitment, and it is becoming the dominant institution of our society, then what will happen? Because unless people don't want, you talk about how people are afraid, or you are denying my rights if I cannot do this or that. Okay, that's fine, but let's leave capitalism. Does capitalism in and of itself has some kind of inherent moral discipline or moral ethical commitment that would guide us? If not, where is the whole global community leading to, because everybody is becoming capitalist now? So I'm feeling afraid about this. I know some of the consequences of this may happen after I am dead, but I'm very, very concerned that if capitalism doesn't have any inherent moral and ethical commitment within itself to treat the human dignity of all with respect, then we're going to be in trouble in the future.
I'm going to defer to the professor here.
No, I just answered a question. You got to field that one.
If I understand your question correctly, is it something in capitalism? Inherent within capitalism that generates these issues? Yeah, it's really a powerful question. And we could stay here for a long time trying to figure that one out. And capitalism has been under, of course, capitalism has been challenged, but what other system do you find, if I could throw it back at you, where it inherently promotes integration and the less prejudice amongst people? What other system is that? What capitalism does to me is that they struggle with it, and they're willing to struggle with it. This government, where an authoritarian government wouldn't even deal with it at all, shut it down. Capitalism is imperfect. Capitalism as a political system, an economic system, has a lot a lot of deficiencies there, but the struggle of it, what I'm thinking about would occur if we were in any type of system, if the mentality is there that one race is superior over another race. It could be capitalism, it could be socialism, it could be Buddhism, you name it. It's the mindset that predates the form of government. And if that mindset is that there is a superior race of people, and they're, because of the condition, the color of our skin, our decisions carry more weight. Nothing else matters. It doesn't make any difference what kind of political system you call it. It's that mindset that we have to get at, that idea that I am superior. And so you're talking about African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, immigrants, the disabled, people who are bi or transsexual, they're all in the same boat because there's an attitude that something's wrong with you. And we're all in the same kind of, in different ways, confronted with the same type of attitude towards us. And and the struggles that we're going through right now is to perfect the system, to make a more perfect union. And maybe capitalism is the only one that allows that struggle to be made. So I wouldn't condemn capitalism just because of its name. I'm looking at the struggles that are going on surrounding that word capitalism and see where we're coming out. And right now, as I look at it, African Americans, natives, Asians, immigrants, transsexual people, bi people, disabled people, poor people, felons, I see all of us, on a slippery slope, and there's a wind at our back. And we're at the Grand Canyon in a sense, and there's this wind at our back. But if we reach down and help each other, we'll get back to the top again, and then it's got to change. It's only been 400 years. It's another 100 years or so, something will, I don't know. I didn't answer your question, but the one answer I have, I don't think it depends on the name capitalism, socialism, whatever. I think more of the mindset that you bring to it.
Thank you all for joining us today and asking great questions and engaging questions. We will have a book signing right outside in our lobby, and we also have food and drinks available for folks. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.